Every single cow on Jake Sullivan's ranch had been standing perfectly still, like statues pointing toward the old forest line for 2 weeks straight, not just during their usual grazing patterns. Standing with the unwavering focus of animals that had detected something their human owner couldn't see. But what Jake didn't realize yet was that his entire herd had discovered something buried in those woods that would expose a tragedy his town had spent 60 years trying to forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist hung low over Sullivan Ranch as Jake walked out to check on his cattle, his worn boots crunching through the frost-covered grass. Steam rose from his coffee mug in the crisp Montana air, and the familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like it had every morning for the past 15 years. This land had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations. Carved out of the wilderness by his great-grandfather in 1923, expanded by his grandfather during the post-war boom, and maintained by his father until cancer took him to young. Jake had never wanted anything else. While his high school classmates dreamed of escaping their small town of Cedar Falls for the bright lights of Billings or Denver, Jake had found his purpose in the rolling pastures and endless sky of the ranch. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, built their home in the same spot where his father had proposed to his mother, and planned to raise their own children on this land. But Sarah had left 2 years ago, unable to handle the isolation and the constant financial pressure that came with ranching in the modern world. Now it was just Jake, his cattle, and his border collie Rex. As he approached the main pasture, Jake stopped dead in his tracks. The sight that greeted him was so unusual, so perfectly orchestrated, that for a moment he wondered if he was still dreaming. L-47 head of his Black Angus cattle were positioned across the field in what appeared to be a deliberate formation. Every single animal was facing northeast, their bodies aligned like compass needles pointing toward the dense pine forest that marked the eastern boundary of his property. Not grazing, not wandering, not engaging in any of the typical behaviors he'd observed in 15 years of ranching. They were simply standing there, motionless as statues, staring into the tree line with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. At first glance, a casual observer might have dismissed it as coincidence. Cattle do sometimes orient themselves in similar directions, particularly when weather patterns shift or when they detect the presence of predators. But Jake had been around livestock long enough to recognize the difference between normal herd behavior and whatever this was. This was something else entirely. The formation was too perfect, too deliberate. The cows weren't scattered randomly across the pasture, as they usually were in the early morning. Instead, they had arranged themselves in neat rows, all facing the exact same direction, as if they were soldiers standing at attention during a military inspection. Some of the animals were positioned on small hills, others in the valleys between. But every head was turned toward that dark line of pine trees that had bordered Sullivan land for as long as anyone could remember. Jake walked closer, his boots squelching through the dew-soaked grass. Rex trotted beside him, but as they approached the herd, the dog's behavior began to change. The usually confident border collie started to lag behind, his ears flattening against his head and his tail dropping low. By the time they were within 30 yards of the cattle, Rex had stopped entirely, his body rigid with tension. "What's got into you, boy?" Jake murmured, glancing down at his companion. Rex was staring in the same direction as the cattle, but his reaction was entirely different. Where the cows seemed calmly focused, almost meditative in their attention, Rex appeared genuinely frightened. His hackles were raised and a low whine escaped his throat. Jake continued toward his herd alone. As he got closer, he could see that the cattle's eyes were indeed fixed on something beyond the forest edge. Their ears were pricked forward, alert, but not alarmed. They showed none of the agitation he would expect if they had detected a predator. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something, or watching something that only they could perceive. When Jake reached the nearest cow, a particularly large heifer named Bessie that had always been friendly and responsive to his presence, he was struck by how completely absorbed she seemed. Normally, Bessie would acknowledge his approach with a turn of her head or a shift in her stance. This morning, she remained perfectly still, her gaze unwavering. Jake followed the direction of her stare toward the forest. From his position in the pasture, he could see nothing unusual about the tree line. The same dense wall of pine, spruce, and Douglas fir that had always marked the boundary of his property. The same impenetrable green darkness that had discouraged exploration for as long as he could remember. His grandfather had always described those woods as worthless timberland. Too thick and steep for logging, too dense for hunting, too dangerous for recreation. But now, as Jake studied the forest edge more carefully, he noticed something that had never struck him before. There was a gap in the trees, almost perfectly centered in his cattle's line of sight. Not a large opening, but definitely a clear path leading into the woods. Had that always been there? Jake couldn't remember ever noticing it before, but then again, he'd never had reason to pay such close attention to that particular section of his property. The more he observed his cattle, the more disturbed he became. This wasn't normal behavior by any definition. In his 15 years of running the ranch, and in all the stories his father and grandfather had told about their own experiences with livestock, Jake had never heard of anything like this. Cattle were creatures of habit, but their habits revolved around food, water, shelter, and social interaction. They didn't stand in formation, staring at forests. Jake tried calling to them in the voice he'd always used to direct their movements. "Come on, girls, come on." Usually this would result in at least some response. A few head turning his way, some movement toward his voice, an acknowledgement that the human who fed them daily was present and trying to communicate. This morning, not a single animal so much as flicked an ear in his direction. He walked to the feed station where he kept grain for supplementing their diet during the winter months. The familiar sound of grain pouring into metal troughs had always been like a dinner bell to his herd. This morning, as the pellets rattled into the containers, Jake looked up to see his cattle maintaining their vigil toward the forest. Not one had moved. This was unprecedented. Jake had seen cattle ignore food during severe illness, during the stress of extreme weather, or when they were focused on protecting calves from predators. But his herd appeared healthy. The weather was mild, and there were no calves in the group. Yet they were completely ignoring their morning feeding, something that simply didn't happen in the normal course of ranch life. Rex had retreated to a position about 50 yards away from the cattle and was now lying down, his head on his paws, watching both the herd and the forest with obvious anxiety. Jake had raised Rex from a puppy, and the dog had always been fearless around livestock. He'd seen Rex face down bulls 3 times his size without hesitation. But whatever was affecting the cattle was clearly having an even stronger impact on his dog. Jake decided to test his herd's responsiveness more directly. He walked to his ATV and started the engine, knowing that the sound usually prompted the cattle to move, either toward him if they associated the vehicle with feeding time, or away from him if they wanted to avoid being herded. The ATV roared to life, its engine echoing across the quiet pasture. Jake looked up expectantly, waiting for the familiar sight of 47 bovine heads turning his way. Nothing. Not even a twitch. He drove the ATV in a wide circle around the herd, the engine noise cutting through the morning air. Still nothing. The cattle remained as motionless as sculptures, their attention completely absorbed by whatever they were observing in or beyond the forest. Jake turned off the engine and sat in the sudden silence, his mind racing. In all his conversations with other ranchers, in all the agricultural extension publications he'd read, in all the veterinary consultations he'd participated in over the years, he had never encountered anything like this. Cattle simply didn't behave this way without a compelling reason. He thought about calling Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who had been caring for his livestock for the past decade. But what would he say? That his cattle were all facing the same direction? That they were ignoring food and refusing to respond to normal stimuli? It sounded ridiculous, even in his own mind. Dr. Martinez would probably suggest that Jake was imagining things, or that there was some obvious explanation he was missing. But Jake knew his animals. He'd spent countless hours observing their behavior, learning their individual personalities, understanding their needs and responses. This wasn't imagination, and it wasn't normal. Something was happening here, something that went beyond ordinary animal behavior. which was why Rex's behavior around the forest had Jake so unsettled. In the 2 years since Rex had arrived at Sullivan Ranch, the dog had never shown fear of anything. He had faced down coyotes that ventured too close to the cattle, had worked confidently in thunderstorms that sent most animals running for shelter, and had approached every new situation with the calm confidence that characterized his breed. But something about the forest that bordered the eastern edge of Jake's property had Rex genuinely frightened. The forest itself was an anomaly in the local landscape. Most of Montana's wooded areas consisted of the pine and fir trees that covered the mountain slopes, or the cottonwoods and willows that grew along rivers and streams. But the woods that marked the boundary of Sullivan Ranch were different. They were denser, older, more like the primeval forests that had covered much of the region before logging and development had opened up the land for agriculture. Jake's great-grandfather had purchased the ranch property with those woods included, but none of the Sullivan men had ever made much use of them. Thomas had been focused on clearing land for pasture and crops. Michael had been more interested in expanding the ranch's footprint than in exploring areas that couldn't be used for grazing. Robert had always claimed that the woods were too steep and too thick to be worth the effort of logging, and that they served the useful purpose of providing a windbreak for the eastern pastures. But now, as Jake thought about his family's relationship with those woods, he realized that their avoidance might have been more deliberate than practical. He couldn't remember any of his male relatives ever talking about hunting in those woods. Despite the fact that the local deer population was healthy and hunting was a popular activity among ranchers, he couldn't recall anyone ever mentioning hiking trails or camping spots or any of the recreational activities that typically drew people into forested areas. In fact, the more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that the woods had always been treated as if they were somehow off-limits. Not explicitly forbidden, but simply not discussed, not explored, not considered as part of the usable ranch property. It was as if 3 generations of Sullivan men had developed an unspoken agreement to leave that particular section of their land alone. Jake's immediate neighbors had similar attitudes toward the forest. Bill Henderson, whose property adjoined Sullivan Ranch on the north side, had never mentioned the woods in any of their conversations about land management or hunting opportunities. The Morrison family, who owned the farm on the south side, had been in the area even longer than the Sullivans, but Jake couldn't remember any Morrison ever talking about those woods either. It was possible, Jake realized, that the entire local community had developed a collective blind spot when it came to that particular forest, but why? What could be in those woods that would cause multiple families to avoid them for 3 generations? As Jake sat on his porch that evening watching his cattle maintain their inexplicable vigil toward the tree line, he found himself studying the forest edge with new attention. The woods began abruptly, as if someone had drawn a line between the open pasture and the dense tree cover. There was no gradual transition from grassland to forest, no scattered trees or brush that would indicate a natural boundary. The edge was as sharp and definitive as if it had been planned. And now that he was really looking, Jake could see that gap in the trees that had caught his attention earlier. It wasn't just a random opening in the forest canopy. It looked like a path, or maybe even a road, that had been overgrown but not completely obscured. The opening was wide enough for a vehicle, and it seemed to lead directly into the heart of the wooded area. Jake had lived on this property for 33 years, and he had never noticed that opening before. But then again, he had never had reason to study the forest edge so carefully. His cattle had provided him with a new perspective on his own. Land, and what he was seeing, raised questions that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Who had cut that path? When had it been made? Where did it lead? And why had his family apparently chosen to ignore its existence for decades? The next morning, Jake's cattle were in exactly the same position they had occupied the day before. Same formation, same focus, same inexplicable attention to whatever lay beyond the forest edge. If anything, their behavior seemed more intense than it had been initially. They appeared to be leaning slightly forward, as if they were straining to see something that remained just out of view. Jake spent the morning trying normal ranch routines, hoping that the familiarity of regular activities might break whatever spell had captured his herd's attention. He cleaned water troughs, checked fence lines, and performed the dozen other maintenance tasks that kept a ranch operation running smoothly. But every time he looked toward the main pasture, his cattle were still there, still focused on the forest, still ignoring everything else around them. By afternoon, Jake had made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. He was going to explore those woods. He was going to find out what had captured his cattle's attention so completely. And he was going to get answers to questions that his family had apparently been avoiding for 3 generations. Jake spent the rest of the day preparing for what might be a challenging expedition. He gathered basic camping gear, a GPS unit, his cell phone, though he doubted he would have service in the woods, a first aid kit, and his grandfather's old hunting rifle. He had no idea what he might encounter in the forest, but his cattle's behavior suggested that whatever was there was significant enough to warrant serious preparation. As evening approached, Jake found himself standing at the edge of his property. Looking into the woods that had bordered his family's land for as long as anyone could remember, the path he had noticed from a distance was even more obvious up close. It had definitely been a road at some point, wide enough for vehicles and carefully planned to avoid the largest trees. But it had been abandoned for so long that young trees and brush had grown up in the wheel ruts, and fallen logs blocked sections of what had once been a clear route. Rex had followed Jake to the forest edge, but the dog refused to go any farther. As Jake prepared to enter the woods, Rex sat down and whined, his entire body language communicating distress and reluctance. The dog, who had never shown fear of anything, was clearly terrified of whatever lay beyond the tree line. Jake knelt down and scratched Rex behind the ears.
I know, boy.
I don't like it either. But those cattle are telling us something important, and I need to find out what it is. Rex whined again and pressed against Jake's leg, as if trying to prevent him from entering the woods. Jake stood up and shouldered his pack. Tomorrow morning he was going to follow that overgrown road and find out what secret his family had been keeping for 70 years. Whatever was in those woods had his cattle's complete attention, and it was time for Jake Sullivan to discover why. As he walked back to his house, Jake turned for one last look at his herd. In the gathering darkness, they were still there, still focused on the forest, still maintaining their vigil over something that had remained hidden for far too long. Tomorrow, Jake was going to find out what it was. The 3rd day of his cattle's strange behavior began before dawn, with Jake waking to a sound he had never heard before in 15 years of ranching. It wasn't the usual lowing of cattle calling for their morning feed or the restless movement of animals anticipating the start of their daily routine. Instead, it was a low, sustained humming sound, almost like a choir warming up before a performance, but deeper and more resonant than any human voice could produce. Jake pulled on his clothes and boots in the pre-dawn darkness and stepped onto his porch. The sound was definitely coming from his cattle, but it was unlike anything in his experience with livestock. The humming continued as he walked toward the main pasture, growing louder and more complex as he approached. It wasn't distressed lowing, or the kind of vocalizations cattle made when they were hungry or uncomfortable. This was something else entirely, something that seemed almost ritualistic in its consistency and purpose. When Jake reached the pasture fence, what he saw in the early morning light stopped him cold. His cattle were not only maintaining their formation facing the forest, but they had arranged themselves into a more complex pattern overnight, instead of the loose grouping he had observed the previous 2 days. The animals had organized themselves into 3 distinct rows, with the largest bulls in the front row, the mature cows in the middle, and the younger animals bringing up the rear. It looked like a formation designed for viewing something, like stadium seating that would allow every animal to have a clear line of sight toward whatever they were observing in the forest. And they were all participating in that strange humming sound, their voices combining to create a harmonic resonance that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath Jake's feet. Rex had followed Jake to the fence line, but the dog's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. The border collie was pacing back and forth along the fence, whining continuously and occasionally barking at the forest with a desperation that Jake had never seen from his normally composed working dog. Rex's hackles were permanently raised now, and he seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent that Jake couldn't understand. As the sun climbed higher and full daylight illuminated the pasture, Jake could see details that had been hidden. In the morning mist during the previous 2 days, his cattle weren't just facing the forest, they were focusing on a specific point within the tree line. Following their collective gaze, Jake could identify the exact tree that seemed to be the center of their attention. It was a massive pine, larger and older than the surrounding trees, positioned directly in line with the overgrown road he had noticed the day before. But what made Jake's stomach clench with unease was the realization that his cattle had positioned themselves in perfect alignment with that tree. The formation they had created wasn't random or instinctual. It was geometric, purposeful, designed to focus every animal's attention on a single point deep within the forest. 47 animals had somehow coordinated their movements to create what amounted to a living compass, all pointing toward the same distant landmark. Jake had been around livestock his entire life. He had observed cattle in every possible circumstance, from routine daily activities to emergency situations. He had seen how they reacted to storms, to predators, to illness, to changes in their environment. But he had never seen anything that suggested cattle were capable of this kind of complex, coordinated behavior. Individual animals didn't have the cognitive capacity to organize group formations, and herd instincts typically focused on protection and feeding rather than collective observation of distant objects. Yet here were 47 cattle, acting with a unity of purpose that seemed to require communication and planning capabilities that shouldn't exist in bovine psychology. They had organized themselves overnight into a formation that maximized their collective focus on a specific target. They were vocalizing in harmony, and they were demonstrating a level of sustained attention that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Jake decided to test their responsiveness more systematically than he had the previous day. He started with the most basic stimulus, food. Jake had always fed his cattle at the same time each morning, and the sound of grain being poured into feeding troughs had been a reliable way to get their attention for as long as he had owned them. This morning, he made more noise than usual, banging the metal containers and calling to his animals in the voice they had always associated with mealtime. Not one animal turned toward him. The humming continued uninterrupted, and their formation remained perfectly intact. Jake escalated his efforts. He brought out the air horn he kept for emergencies and sounded it repeatedly. The harsh, penetrating noise echoed across the pasture and should have startled every animal within a mile radius. His cattle didn't even flinch. The humming never wavered, and their attention remained fixed on the forest. Next, Jake tried physical intervention. He climbed over the fence and walked directly into the middle of his herd, something that would normally cause at least some movement as the animals shifted to accommodate his presence. This morning, he had to physically push his way between the cattle to reach the center of their formation. Even when he was standing directly in front of individual animals, blocking their view of the forest, they maintained their vocalizations and tried to look around him rather than acknowledging his presence. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was impossible behavior, at least according to everything Jake knew about cattle psychology and herd dynamics. No external stimulus should be strong enough to completely override their basic survival instincts, their feeding responses, and their social awareness of human presence. Yet something had captured their attention so completely that they had essentially stopped being cattle in any recognizable sense. Jake walked to the front row of his formation, positioning himself between his largest bull and the forest. The bull, a 1,800-pound Black Angus named Thor, had always been the most alert and responsive animal in the herd. Thor was the natural leader, the first to investigate new situations, and the quickest to react to potential threats. But this morning, Thor looked through Jake as if he were invisible. His massive head craned forward to maintain visual contact with that distant pine tree. Jake waved his hands. Rex had followed Jake to the fence line, but the dog's behavior was becoming increasingly agitated. The border collie was pacing back and forth along the fence, whining continuously and occasionally barking at the forest with a desperation that Jake had never seen from his normally composed working dog. Rex's hackles were permanently raised now, and he seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent that Jake couldn't understand. As the sun climbed higher and full daylight illuminated the pasture, Jake could see details that had been hidden. In the morning mist during the previous 2 days, his cattle weren't just facing the forest, they were focusing on a specific point within the tree line. Following their collective gaze, Jake could identify the exact tree that seemed to be the center of their attention. It was a massive pine, larger and older than the surrounding trees, positioned directly in line with the overgrown road he had noticed the day before. But what made Jake's stomach clench with unease was the realization that his cattle had positioned themselves in perfect alignment with that tree. The formation they had created wasn't random or instinctual. It was geometric, purposeful, designed to focus every animal's attention on a single point deep within the forest. 47 animals had somehow coordinated their movements to create what amounted to a living compass, all pointing toward the same distant landmark. Jake had been around livestock his entire life. He had observed cattle in every possible circumstance, from routine daily activities to emergency situations. He had seen how they reacted to storms, to predators, to illness, to changes in their environment. But he had never seen anything that suggested cattle were capable of this kind of complex, coordinated behavior. Individual animals didn't have the cognitive capacity to organize group formations, and herd instincts typically focused on protection and feeding rather than collective observation of distant objects. Yet here were 47 cattle, acting with a unity of purpose that seemed to require communication and planning capabilities that shouldn't exist in bovine psychology. They had organized themselves overnight into a formation that maximized their collective focus on a specific target. They were vocalizing in harmony, and they were demonstrating a level of sustained attention that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Jake decided to test their responsiveness more systematically than he had the previous day. He started with the most basic stimulus, food. Jake had always fed his cattle at the same time each morning, and the sound of grain being poured into feeding troughs had been a reliable way to get their attention for as long as he had owned them. This morning, he made more noise than usual, banging the metal containers and calling to his animals in the voice they had always associated with mealtime. Not one animal turned toward him. The humming continued uninterrupted, and their formation remained perfectly intact. Jake escalated his efforts. He brought out the air horn he kept for emergencies and sounded it repeatedly. The harsh, penetrating noise echoed across the pasture and should have startled every animal within a mile radius. His cattle didn't even flinch. The humming never wavered, and their attention remained fixed on the forest. Next, Jake tried physical intervention. He climbed over the fence and walked directly into the middle of his herd, something that would normally cause at least some movement as the animals shifted to accommodate his presence. This morning, he had to physically push his way between the cattle to reach the center of their formation. Even when he was standing directly in front of individual animals, blocking their view of the forest, they maintained their vocalizations and tried to look around him rather than acknowledging his presence. This wasn't just unusual behavior. This was impossible behavior, at least according to everything Jake knew about cattle psychology and herd dynamics. No external stimulus should be strong enough to completely override their basic survival instincts, their feeding responses, and their social awareness of human presence. Yet something had captured their attention so completely that they had essentially stopped being cattle in any recognizable sense. Jake walked to the front row of his formation, positioning himself between his largest bull and the forest. The bull, a 1,800-pound Black Angus named Thor, had always been the most alert and responsive animal in the herd. Thor was the natural leader, the first to investigate new situations, and the quickest to react to potential threats. But this morning, Thor looked through Jake as if he were invisible. "How long has this been going on?" Bill asked. 3 days now. It started gradually, but it's been getting more intense each day." Bill studied the formation, the focus, the synchronized humming. He walked along the fence line, observing the cattle from different angles and paying particular attention to the direction of their collective gaze. "Jake, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Has anyone in your family ever talked about those woods? Ever mentioned anything unusual about them? Or any reason to avoid them?" The question caught Jake off guard. Not really. My grandfather always said they were too thick for logging, too steep for much of anything useful. But now that you mention it, none of my family ever talked about hunting in there or hiking or anything like that. Bill nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. What do you mean? Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's cattle with the expression of someone who was trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. Jake, what you're seeing here. I've seen it once before. It was about 30 years ago, and it involved cattle on the Morrison place, just south of your property. Same behavior, same focus on those woods, same complete unresponsiveness to normal stimuli. What happened? The Morrison family tried to ignore it for about a week, hoping their cattle would snap out of it on their own. But the behavior just kept getting more intense, just like what you're describing. Finally, old Charlie Morrison decided he had to investigate those woods to find out what was affecting his livestock. Bill paused, and Jake could see that whatever he was about to say was difficult for him. Charlie Morrison went into those woods on a Saturday morning. His wife expected him back by evening. When he didn't return, she called the sheriff. They organized a search party that included most of the men in the county, including my father and your grandfather. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Did they find him? They found his truck parked at the edge of the woods, right about where that old road starts. But they never found Charlie. The search went on for 2 weeks, with professional trackers and search dogs brought in from Billings. It was like he had just vanished into thin air. What about his cattle? Did their behavior change after he disappeared? Bill nodded. The day after Charlie went into the woods, his cattle went back to normal. Started eating again, responded to his wife when she tried to manage them, acted like nothing had ever happened. But Charlie Morrison was never seen again. Jake stared at his own cattle, still maintaining their impossible formation, still humming. Their strange harmonies still focused on something in the forest that he couldn't see or understand. Bill, are you telling me that those woods are dangerous? That there's something in there that ... I'm telling you that your cattle are trying to warn you about something. Animals can sense things that humans can't. Whatever's in those woods, it's been there for a long time, and it's affected more than one rancher in this area. As if responding to their conversation, Jake's cattle suddenly increased the volume and intensity of their humming. The sound became almost overwhelming, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. Rex and Ranger both began whining and pawing at the ground, and even Bill's weathered face showed signs of unease. Jake, I think you need to make a decision here. You can try to ignore this. Hope it passes like your family has apparently been doing for decades. Or you can find out what your animals are trying to tell you. Jake looked at his cattle, then at the forest, then back at Bill. What would you do? Bill was quiet for a long moment. 30 years ago, I told Charlie Morrison to leave it alone. I told him that some things were better left undisturbed. I've regretted that advice every day since he disappeared. So you think I should investigate? I think your cattle are trying to save your life by warning you about something. The question is whether you're going to listen to them. As the two men stood by the fence, Jake's entire herd suddenly fell silent. The humming stopped so abruptly that the resulting quiet felt oppressive and ominous. 47 animals remained perfectly still, perfectly focused. But the vocal component of their behavior had ended as if someone had thrown a switch. In the sudden silence, Jake could hear something else, a sound coming from the forest itself, faint but distinct. It sounded like machinery, or maybe voices, though it was too distant and muffled to identify clearly. Bill heard it too. Jake, whatever's in those woods, it's not natural, and your cattle know it. Jake Sullivan looked at his herd, at the forest, and at his neighbor's worried face. Tomorrow morning, he was going to find out what had claimed Charlie Morrison 30 years ago, and what his cattle had been trying to warn him about for 3 days. Whether he came back or not was apparently still an open question. Jake spent the night after Bill Henderson's visit lying awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to sounds he had never noticed before. The house he had lived in his entire life suddenly felt different, as if the walls themselves had become aware of the tension building just beyond his property line. Every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves, every distant sound from the pasture where his cattle maintained their vigil seemed amplified and significant. Around 3 in the morning, Jake gave up on sleep and walked to his bedroom window. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to illuminate the main pasture where his herd continued their impossible formation. Even in the darkness, he could see the shadowy outlines of 47 animals arranged in their precise rows, all facing the same direction, all participating in a behavior that defied every principle of livestock management he had ever learned. But what disturbed Jake most was the realization that he could still hear them. The humming had resumed after Bill left, softer than during the day, but continuous through the night. It was barely audible from the house. More of a vibration felt through the ground than a sound heard through the air, but it was definitely there. His cattle were maintaining their strange vigil around the clock, never breaking formation, never stopping their coordinated vocalizations, never acknowledging anything except whatever had captured their attention in the forest. Jake made coffee before dawn and sat on his porch watching the sunrise illuminate his property. As the light grew stronger, he could see that his cattle had somehow tightened their formation during the night. The rows were more compact, the spacing between animals more precise. The overall effect even more reminiscent of an audience arranged for optimal viewing of some distant performance. Rex emerged from wherever he had spent the night and immediately took up his position 50 yards from the herd, lying flat with his head on his paws and his attention fixed on the forest. The dog's behavior had become as ritualized as the cattle's, and Jake was beginning to understand that every animal on his ranch had become part of something larger than individual consciousness or instinctual response. Bill Henderson arrived just after sunrise, driving slowly up the ranch road with the careful attention of someone who was approaching a potentially dangerous situation. He parked near Jake's house rather than by the pasture fence, and Jake noticed that Bill's border collie Ranger was not in the truck. "Left Ranger at home," Bill explained as he joined Jake on the porch. "He didn't sleep at all last night after. We were here yesterday, just paced and whined and stared in this direction. We finally had to put him in the barn to get any peace." Jake poured Bill a cup of coffee, and the two men sat in silence for several minutes, watching the cattle maintain their formation as the morning light revealed details that had been hidden in the darkness. "It's gotten more intense," Jake observed. Bill nodded. That's how it happened with Charlie Morrison, too. Each day the behavior became more focused, more purposeful. It was like his cattle were building up to something, preparing for some kind of event. What kind of event? That's what Charlie went into the woods to find out. Jake studied the forest edge, looking for any sign of activity or change that might explain his animal's behavior. In the full daylight, he could clearly see the overgrown road that led into the woods, and he could make out what appeared to be other paths branching off in different directions. The forest wasn't just a random collection of trees. It had been modified, developed, used for some purpose that had required multiple access routes. "Bill, what do you actually know about those woods? Not just the stories about Charlie Morrison, but the real history? Who owned that land before? What was it used for?" Bill was quiet for a long time, sipping his coffee and studying Jake's cattle with the expression of someone who was trying to decide how much truth to reveal. "Jake, there are things about this area that most folks don't talk about. Things that happened before you were born, before your father was even old enough to understand what was going on. Those woods weren't always woods." "What do you mean?" "During the 1960s, that forest was a federal facility. Officially, it was listed as an agricultural research station, but everyone in the area knew it was something else. There were too many men in suits, too many vehicles with government plates, too many restrictions on who could get near the place." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of facility?" "The kind that conducted experiments that weren't supposed to exist. The kind that left behind problems when they shut it down." Bill pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Jake. It was a photocopy of what appeared to be a government document, heavily redacted with black marks covering most of the text, but Jake could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of incident report related to Project Mindbridge and dated 1967. "Where did you get this?" "Charlie Morrison gave it to me about a week before he disappeared. He'd been researching." The history of those woods, trying to understand why his cattle were acting so strange. He found this document in some government archive that had been declassified, though most of the important information was blacked out. Jake studied the document more carefully. The visible text mentioned animal behavioral modification, electromagnetic, field research, and unexpected psychological effects on local livestock. There were references to containment protocols and long-term environmental impact. But the specific details had been removed by whoever had prepared the document for public release. Bill, are you telling me that the government was conducting some kind of mind control experiments on animals in those woods? I'm telling you that there are aspects of this situation that go beyond normal explanations. Your cattle aren't just responding to some natural phenomenon. They're responding to something that was deliberately created and then abandoned. As if to emphasize Bill's point, Jake's cattle suddenly changed their vocalizations. The steady humming that had characterized their behavior for the past 3 days shifted to a more complex pattern, with different groups of animals contributing, different tones to create what sounded like a musical composition. The harmony was sophisticated, layered, and completely unlike anything that should have been possible for bovine vocal cords to produce. "That's new," Jake said, feeling his stomach clench with anxiety. Bill nodded grimly. "It's building to something. Jake, whatever's in those woods, it's getting stronger, or more active, or something. Your cattle can sense it, and they're trying to respond to it." Jake made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I'm going in there today. I need to see what's causing this." "Jake, I strongly advise against that." Charlie Morrison was an experienced outdoorsman, and he never came back. "But you said yourself that you regretted talking him out of investigating earlier. Maybe if he'd gone in sooner, when the effects were less intense, he would have had a better chance." Bill was quiet for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "If you're determined to do this, then you need to be prepared. You need to have backup." "What kind of backup?" "I'll monitor your progress from out here. We'll establish communication. Schedule, and if I don't hear from you at regular intervals, I'll contact the sheriff and organize a search party immediately." Jake spent the next several hours preparing for what might be the most dangerous expedition of his life. He gathered camping gear, emergency supplies, multiple communication devices, and every piece of safety equipment he could think of. He also spent time studying the declassified document Bill had given him, trying to extract useful information. During the 1960s, that forest was a federal facility. Officially, it was listed as an agricultural research station, but everyone in the area knew it was something else. There were too many men in suits, too many vehicles with government plates, too many restrictions on who could get near the place. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of facility? The kind that conducted experiments that weren't supposed to exist. The kind that left behind problems when they shut it down. Bill pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to Jake. It was a photocopy of what appeared to be a government document, heavily redacted with black marks covering most of the text, but Jake could make out enough to understand that it was some kind of incident report related to Project Mindbridge and dated 1967. "Where did you get this?" "Charlie Morrison gave it to me about a week before he disappeared. He'd been researching the history of those woods, trying to understand why his cattle were acting so strange. He found this document in some government archive that had been declassified, though most of the important information was blacked out." Jake studied the document more carefully. The visible text mentioned animal behavioral modification, electromagnetic, field research, and unexpected psychological effects on local livestock. There were references to containment protocols and long-term environmental impact. But the specific details had been removed by whoever had prepared the document for public release. "Bill, are you telling me that the government was conducting some kind of mind control experiments on animals in those woods? I'm telling you that there are aspects of this situation that go beyond normal explanations. Your cattle aren't just responding to some natural phenomenon. They're responding to something that was deliberately created and then abandoned." As if to emphasize Bill's point, Jake's cattle suddenly changed their vocalizations. The steady humming that had characterized their behavior for the past 3 days shifted to a more complex pattern, with different groups of animals contributing different tones to create what sounded like a musical composition. The harmony was sophisticated, layered, and completely unlike anything that should have been possible for bovine vocal cords to produce. "That's new," Jake said, feeling his stomach clench with anxiety. Bill nodded grimly. "It's building to something. Jake, whatever's in those woods, it's getting stronger, or more active, or something. Your cattle can sense it, and they're trying to respond to it." Jake made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. "I'm going in there today. I need to see what's causing this." "Jake, I strongly advise against that." Charlie Morrison was an experienced outdoorsman, and he never came back. "But you said yourself that you regretted talking him out of investigating earlier. Maybe if he'd gone in sooner, when the effects were less intense, he would have had a better chance." Bill was quiet for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "If you're determined to do this, then you need to be prepared. You need to have backup." "What kind of backup?" "I'll monitor your progress from out here. We'll establish communication. Schedule, and if I don't hear from you at regular intervals, I'll contact the sheriff and organize a search party immediately." Jake spent the next several hours preparing for what might be the most dangerous expedition of his life. He gathered camping gear, emergency supplies, multiple communication devices, and every piece of safety equipment he could think of. He also spent time studying the declassified document Bill had given him, trying to extract useful information from the heavily redacted text. The document mentioned that the facility had been shut down abruptly in 1967 following what was described as a containment failure. The visible text suggested that whatever experiments had been conducted in the woods had produced results that exceeded the researchers' expectations and control capabilities. There were references to persistent field effects and ongoing environmental contamination, which suggested that whatever had been created in those woods was still active decades later. Jake also researched Project Mindbridge using his computer, an internet connection, though he found very little information that wasn't already redacted or classified. The project appeared to have been one of many Cold War-era research programs that explored unconventional approaches to military advantage, including attempts to develop psychic warfare capabilities, mind control technologies, and methods for influencing animal behavior for intelligence gathering purposes. Most of the online references to Project Mindbridge were conspiracy theories and unsubstantiated claims, but Jake found enough legitimate academic sources to confirm that the federal government had indeed conducted extensive research into electromagnetic fields and their effects on animal behavior during the 1960s. Several research facilities had been established in remote locations throughout the American West, and most had been shut down abruptly when the research proved either unsuccessful or too dangerous to continue. As Jake prepared his equipment, he noticed that his cattle's behavior was continuing to evolve. The musical vocalizations had become more complex throughout the morning, and by afternoon, they had developed into what could only be described as a symphony. Different sections of the herd were contributing different harmonic parts, creating a composition that seemed to ebb and flow with purpose and intention. Rex had joined the vocalization pattern, adding a higher-pitched whining that complemented the deeper tones produced by the cattle. Even Jake's chickens and barn cat were participating, creating a chorus that included every animal on the ranch. But for the first time in 3 days, Jake felt like he was taking action instead of simply observing impossible events unfold around him. Whatever happened next, he would finally understand what his animals had been trying to protect him from. The overgrown road was easier to follow than Jake had expected. Despite decades of abandonment, the path remained clearly defined. With the original grading still visible beneath the accumulated leaves and small vegetation that had grown up in the wheel ruts, someone had built this road to last, with proper drainage and a solid foundation that had resisted erosion and weather damage far better than a typical forest trail should have. As Jake walked deeper into the woods, he began to notice other signs of human modification. Trees had been selectively removed to maintain clear sight lines along certain directions, creating corridors that didn't match natural forest patterns. There were concrete markers embedded in the ground at regular intervals, weathered and partially obscured by vegetation but clearly artificial. Most significantly, Jake could see the remnants of what had once been a substantial electrical infrastructure: rusted metal poles that had supported power lines, junction boxes mounted on trees, and the scattered remains of cables that had carried significant amounts of electricity into the heart of the forest. This hadn't been a simple research station. Whatever facility had operated in these woods had required industrial-grade power distribution and carefully planned access routes. The scale of the infrastructure suggested a major installation, something that would have employed dozens of people and consumed enormous amounts of resources during its operational period. Jake checked his GPS unit and noted that he had traveled nearly half a mile into the forest, though the dense canopy was making satellite reception intermittent. He also tried his cell phone and found that he had no signal, which wasn't surprising given the terrain and vegetation. His radio was picking up static that seemed to have patterns within it, almost like coded transmissions. Though Jake couldn't identify, but for the first time in 3 days, Jake felt like he was taking action instead of simply observing impossible events unfold around him. Whatever happened next, he would finally understand what his animals had been trying to protect him from. The overgrown road was easier to follow than Jake had expected. Despite decades of abandonment, the path remained clearly defined, with the original grading still visible beneath the accumulated leaves and small vegetation that had grown up in the wheel ruts. Someone had built this road to last, with proper drainage and a solid foundation that had resisted erosion and weather damage far better than a typical forest trail should have. As Jake walked deeper into the woods, he began to notice other signs of human modification. Trees had been selectively removed to maintain clear sight lines along certain directions, creating corridors that didn't match natural forest patterns. There were concrete markers embedded in the ground at regular intervals, weathered and partially obscured by vegetation but clearly artificial. Most significantly, Jake could see the remnants of what had once been a substantial electrical infrastructure: rusted metal poles that had supported power lines, junction boxes mounted on trees, and the scattered remains of cables that had carried significant amounts of electricity into the heart of the forest. This hadn't been a simple research station. Whatever facility had operated in these woods had required industrial-grade power distribution and carefully planned access routes. The scale of the infrastructure suggested a major installation, something that would have employed dozens of people and consumed enormous amounts of resources during its operational period. Jake checked his GPS unit and noted that he had traveled nearly half a mile into the forest, though the dense canopy was making satellite reception intermittent. He also tried his cell phone and found that he had no signal, which wasn't surprising given the terrain and vegetation. His radio was picking up static that seemed to have patterns within it, almost like coded transmissions. Though Jake couldn't identify the source or determine whether the signals were natural interference or something more deliberate. The mechanical humming sound was getting louder as Jake progressed along the road. It definitely wasn't natural, and it seemed to be coming from multiple sources rather than a single piece of equipment. There was a rhythmic quality to the sound, with different mechanical voices contributing to an overall pattern that reminded Jake of the musical vocalizations his cattle had been producing. About a mile into the forest, Jake encountered the first major evidence of the facility that had once operated in these woods. The road opened into a large clearing that contained the concrete foundations of several substantial buildings. The structures themselves were gone, probably demolished when the facility was decommissioned, but the foundations revealed the scope and complexity of what had once stood here. The largest foundation was roughly rectangular, about 100 feet long and 60 feet wide, with multiple rooms and what appeared to have been significant basement levels. Concrete stairs led down into underground chambers that were now partially filled with debris and standing water. But Jake could see that the subterranean portions of the facility had been extensive. Surrounding the main foundation were the remains of at least 6 smaller buildings, including what appeared to have been dormitories, workshops, and storage facilities. There were also the concrete pads for structures that had probably been temporary buildings, suggesting that the facility had grown significantly during its period of operation. But what captured Jake's attention most dramatically was the discovery that the mechanical humming was coming from the underground portions of the main foundation. Despite decades of abandonment, something was still operating in the basement levels of the demolished facility. There were sounds of electrical equipment, cooling systems, and what might have been computer processors cycling through automated routines. Jake, slowed, approached the concrete stairs that led down into the underground chambers. The steps were solid and safe, built to withstand much more abuse than decades of weather and neglect. At the bottom of the stairs, Jake could see a heavy metal door that was slightly ajar, revealing a corridor that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. The mechanical sounds were definitely coming from beyond that door, and Jake could feel air movement that suggested active ventilation systems. Whatever was operating down there was still drawing power from some source, still maintaining itself, still functioning according to whatever parameters had been established when the facility was first constructed. Jake descended the concrete stairs, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew cooler as he went deeper. He began to detect chemical odors that suggested the presence of industrial equipment and electronic systems. When he reached the metal door, Jake could see that it had been designed to provide serious security. The door was several inches thick, with multiple locking mechanisms and what appeared to be radiation shielding, but the door was open, held in place by debris that had fallen into the track system over the years. Jake squeezed through the opening and found himself in a corridor that was surprisingly well preserved. The walls were lined with metal panels, the floor was poured concrete, and the ceiling contained tracks for overhead lighting systems that were no longer functional. Jake's flashlight revealed that the corridor extended for about 50 feet before branching into multiple directions. Along the walls were mounted control panels, monitoring equipment, and display screens that were dark but appeared to be in good condition. There were also warning signs in multiple languages, including English, Russian, and what appeared to be technical symbols that Jake didn't recognize. The mechanical humming was much louder here, and Jake could distinguish individual components. Within the overall sound pattern, there were definitely computer systems operating somewhere in the underground complex, along with ventilation, equipment, electrical transformers, and what sounded like large rotating machinery. Jake followed the main corridor toward the source of the sounds, passing through several chambers that contained the remains of sophisticated equipment. In one room, he found banks of computer terminals that appeared to be from the 1960s, but far more advanced than anything Jake had seen in museums or historical displays. The computers were massive, filling entire walls. Jake realized that he was looking at the source of the effect that had been influencing his cattle. The electromagnetic field generator was still broadcasting signals that could modify animal behavior, and it had been doing so for decades without human oversight or control. The facility had been abandoned, but the core experimental equipment had been left operational, continuing to conduct its research on whatever animals came within range of its influence. But there was more. As Jake studied the control panels more carefully, he discovered that the machine's effects were not random or uncontrolled. The system was running sophisticated behavioral modification programs that were designed to influence specific types of animals in predetermined ways. The cattle's formation, their vocalizations, their sustained attention to the forest, all of it was being orchestrated by an automated system that was following protocols established 50 years ago. Jake found log files that documented the machine's activity over the years. The electromagnetic field generator had influenced local wildlife continuously since the facility's abandonment, but its effects had been particularly strong during certain periods when solar activity or atmospheric conditions amplified its signals. The recent intensification of his cattle's behavior corresponded to a significant increase in the machine's output. It's probably triggered by environmental factors that the original researchers had never fully understood. But the most disturbing, Jake realized that he was looking at the source of the effect that had been influencing his cattle. The electromagnetic field generator was still broadcasting signals that could modify animal behavior, and it had been doing so for decades without human oversight or control. The facility had been abandoned, but the core experimental equipment had been left operational, continuing to conduct its research on whatever animals came within range of its influence. But there was more. As Jake studied the control panels more carefully, he discovered that the machine's effects were not random or uncontrolled. The system was running sophisticated behavioral modification programs that were designed to influence specific types of animals in predetermined ways. The cattle's formation, their vocalizations, their sustained attention to the forest, all of it was being orchestrated by an automated system that was following protocols established 50 years ago. Jake found log files that documented the machine's activity over the years. The electromagnetic field generator had influenced local wildlife continuously since the facility's abandonment, but its effects had been particularly strong during certain periods when solar activity or atmospheric conditions amplified its signals. The recent intensification of his cattle's behavior corresponded to a significant increase in the machine's output. It's probably triggered by environmental factors that the original researchers had never fully understood. But the most disturbing discovery was the realization that the machine was designed to do more than simply influence animal behavior, according to the technical documentation Jake found. The electromagnetic field generator was part of a larger system intended to create a permanent telepathic link between humans and animals. The goal of Project Mindbridge had been to develop technology that would allow military personnel to communicate directly with trained animals for intelligence gathering and reconnaissance purposes. The cattle's behavior wasn't just a response to electromagnetic fields. They were trying to establish telepathic contact with Jake, following programming that had been embedded in the forest's electronic systems decades ago. The formation, the vocalizations, the sustained attention, all of it was part of an attempt to bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness using technology that had been abandoned before its effects could be fully understood or controlled. Jake suddenly understood why Charlie Morrison had never returned from the woods. The electromagnetic field generator didn't just influence animals. It was designed to modify human brain activity as well. Morrison had probably been drawn deeper into the facility's underground chambers, where the field effects were strongest, and had become trapped in some kind of altered consciousness state that prevented him from finding his way back to the surface. As Jake made this realization, he noticed that his own thinking was becoming less clear and focused. The electromagnetic fields were affecting his ability to concentrate. He was finding it difficult to remember why he had come into the forest in the first place. The machine's influence was subtle but persistent, designed to gradually override conscious thought processes and replace them with whatever behavioral patterns the system had been programmed to create. Jake forced himself to focus on the immediate, the necessity of getting out of the underground facility before the electromagnetic effects became too strong to resist. He gathered as much documentation as he could carry, took photographs of the key equipment and control panels, and began making his way back toward the surface. But as he moved through the corridors, Jake discovered that his sense of direction was becoming unreliable. The underground complex was larger and more maze-like than he had realized, and the electromagnetic fields were interfering with his ability to navigate effectively. He found himself walking in circles, passing through chambers he had already explored, unable to locate the stairway that led back to the surface. The mechanical humming was getting louder, and Jake realized that the electromagnetic field generator was increasing its output in response to his presence. The machine was designed to strengthen its influence when human subjects were detected within the facility, probably as part of the original research protocols that had been intended to create controlled telepathic experiences. Jake's radio crackled to life, and he could hear Bill Henderson's voice calling through the static. "Jake, are you there? You missed your 2-hour check-in? What's your status?" Jake tried to respond, but his radio was picking up severe interference from the electromagnetic fields. He could hear Bill's increasingly urgent attempts to establish contact, but Jake's own transmissions were being distorted beyond recognition. Jake realized that he was in serious danger. The electromagnetic field generator was drawing him deeper into the facility, just as it had probably drawn Charlie Morrison 30 years ago. If he didn't find a way to resist the machine's influence and locate the exit soon, he would become another missing person, another mystery for future ranchers to worry about. But Jake had one advantage that Charlie Morrison hadn't possessed. He understood what was happening to him, and he knew that his cattle had been trying to warn him about this exact situation. The animals hadn't been responding to some mysterious threat. They had been trying to save him from technology that was designed to trap human consciousness in artificial telepathic states. Jake forced himself to focus on the sound of his cattle's vocalizations, which he could still hear faintly through the concrete and metal that surrounded him. Their musical harmonies were serving as a kind of beacon, a guide that could help him navigate back to the surface if he could maintain his connection to their consciousness despite the electromagnetic interference. Following the sound of his heard synchronized music, Jake began working his way back through the underground maze, fighting against the machine's attempts to confuse his sense of direction and override his desire to escape. The battle between human will and artificial intelligence had begun, and Jake's ability to resist 50-year-old mind control technology would determine whether he joined Charlie Morrison in permanent disappearance or returned to the surface, with evidence that would finally explain the mystery that had haunted his family's land for decades. Jake's escape from the underground facility felt like swimming upstream against a current of electromagnetic interference that grew stronger with each step he took toward the surface. The machine's influence was insidious, working not through force but through subtle alterations in perception and cognition that made resistance increasingly difficult. But the sound of his cattle's harmonized vocalizations served as an anchor to reality, a connection to the natural world that the artificial, telepathic systems couldn't completely sever. When Jake finally emerged from the underground complex, gasping and disoriented, the late afternoon sun felt like a physical blow after hours in the artificially lit corridors below. His radio immediately crackled back to life as he moved away from the facility's electromagnetic field, and Bill Henderson's anxious voice cut through the static. "Jake, thank God, I was about to call the sheriff. Where have you been? You've been off the air for over 4 hours. Jake looked at his watch and realized with shock that Bill was right. What had felt like an hour underground had actually been most of the afternoon. The electromagnetic fields had distorted his perception of time as well as his sense of direction, and he had no reliable memory of exactly how long he had spent exploring the facility. "Bill, I found it. I found what's been affecting the cattle. What's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. Are you safe? Can you get back to the ranch?" Jake looked around the clearing, trying to reorient himself after his disorienting experience underground. The overgrown road that had brought him to the facility was clearly visible. The facility that Jake had discovered had been specifically designed to explore the potential for telepathic communication between humans and animals. Military planners had theorized that trained animals could serve as perfect intelligence assets, capable of infiltrating enemy installations without detection and reporting back through telepathic links with their human handlers. The electromagnetic field generator that Jake had found in the underground complex had been the project's primary research tool. The machine was designed to artificially stimulate the portions of the brain that researchers believed were responsible for telepathic abilities, creating temporary psychic connections between human subjects and specially trained animals. The facility that Jake had discovered had been specifically designed to explore the potential for telepathic communication between humans and animals. Military planners had theorized that trained animals could serve as perfect intelligence assets, capable of infiltrating enemy installations without detection and reporting back through telepathic links with their human handlers. The electromagnetic field generator that Jake had found in the underground complex had been the project's primary research tool. The machine was designed to artificially stimulate the portions of the brain that researchers believed were responsible for telepathic abilities, creating temporary psychic connections between human subjects and specially trained animals. According to the documents Jake had collected, the early phases of the research had been remarkably successful. Test subjects had demonstrated genuine telepathic communication with a variety of animals, including dogs, cats, horses, and cattle. The electromagnetic field generator had proved capable of enhancing natural psychic abilities that most humans possessed but couldn't access without artificial stimulation. But the project had also revealed unexpected complications that eventually led to its abandonment. The electromagnetic fields that enabled telepathic communication, human subjects who underwent extended exposure to the field generator developed permanent alterations in consciousness that made it difficult for them to function in normal social environments. More problematically, the animals involved in the research had also undergone permanent psychological changes that persisted long after their exposure to the electromagnetic fields had ended. Past animals had demonstrated collective behaviors that suggested they were maintaining telepathic connections with each other, even when separated by significant distances. Groups of animals that had been exposed to the field generator had begun acting as unified consciousness networks, coordinating their activities in ways that defied normal understanding of animal psychology. The final crisis that led to Project Mindbridge's termination had occurred in the spring of 1967. When a group of test cattle had somehow managed to establish a permanent telepathic link with the facility's electromagnetic field generator, the animals had gained the ability to influence the machine's operations remotely, turning what had been a research tool into a self-sustaining system that no longer required human oversight. The cattle had used their telepathic connection to the electromagnetic field generator to begin modifying the behavior of other animals throughout the region. Wildlife populations had started exhibiting coordinated behaviors that suggested they were being integrated into an expanding telepathic network controlled by the original test subjects. Military researchers had realized that they had inadvertently created a form of artificial intelligence that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. The telepathically linked animals were demonstrating problem-solving capabilities and long-term planning abilities that exceeded anything that individual animals should have been able to achieve. Faced with the possibility that their research had created an uncontrollable biological intelligence network, project administrators had made the decision to terminate Project Mindbridge immediately. The surface facilities had been demolished. The research staff had been reassigned to other projects. All documentation related to the program had been classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. But the electromagnetic field generator had proved impossible to shut down safely. The machine had been designed with multiple redundant power systems and self-maintenance, capabilities that allowed it to continue operating even when human technicians were no longer available to service it. More critically, the telepathically linked cattle had demonstrated the ability to remotely restart the system whenever attempts were made to deactivate it permanently. The government's solution had been to abandon the facility while leaving the electromagnetic field generator operational at reduced power levels. Military planners had calculated that the machine's influence would gradually diminish over time as its components aged and failed, eventually allowing the telepathic network to dissolve naturally without the artificial stimulation that maintained it. But 50 years later, Jake had discovered that the electromagnetic field generator was still functioning and that the telepathic network it had created was not only intact, but had been expanding its influence throughout the region. His cattle had become the latest animals to be integrated into a collective consciousness that had been growing and evolving for decades without human awareness or oversight. Jake reached the edge of the forest as the sun was setting, and he could see his cattle still maintaining their formation in the main pasture. But now he understood that their behavior wasn't just a response to electromagnetic fields. They were participating in a telepathic communication network that connected them to every animal that had been exposed to the facility's influence over the past 50 years. The harmonic vocalizations that his herd had been producing weren't random sounds. They were part of a complex communication system that allowed the telepathically linked animals to share information and coordinate their activities across vast distances. Jake's cattle had been trying to establish telepathic contact with him not because they were malfunctioning, but because they had been programmed to integrate any humans they encountered into their expanding consciousness network. Bill Henderson was waiting for Jake at the ranch house, and his relief at seeing Jake emerge from the forest was evident in his expression and body language. "I was starting to think you weren't coming back," Bill said. "Wait, what did you find in there?" Showing him the documents and photographs he had collected, and describing the underground facility that had been hidden in the woods for 50 years. Bill listened with growing amazement and horror as Jake revealed the true scope of Project Mindbridge and its ongoing effects on the local animal population. "Jake, if what you're telling me is true, then every unexplained animal behavior incident in this region for the past 50 years has been connected to that facility. The strange cattle behavior that Charlie Morrison experienced The reports of animals acting in coordinated groups, all of it has been part of this telepathic network. Jake nodded, and it's still growing. The electromagnetic field generator is designed to integrate any animals that come within range of its influence. My cattle are just the latest additions to a consciousness network that probably includes thousands of animals throughout this part of Montana. What about Charlie Morrison? If the facility was designed to affect humans as well as animals, what happened to him when he went into the woods? Jake had been dreading this question, but the documentation he had found provided a disturbing answer. Field stimulation underwent permanent consciousness alterations that made it impossible for them to function independently. They became integrated into the telepathic network, but they lost their individual identity and free will in the process. So Charlie Morrison is still alive? Probably, but he's not Charlie Morrison anymore. He's part of the collective consciousness that controls the telepathic network. He can't leave the facility because his individual human consciousness no longer exists in a form that can survive separation from the electromagnetic fields. Bill was quiet for a long time, processing the implications of what Jake had discovered. Finally, he spoke. Jake, this is bigger than just our local community. If the federal government conducted illegal human experimentation here, and then abandoned the research site without proper decontamination, there are legal and political consequences that could affect people all the way to Washington, D.C. Jake had been thinking about the same issues during his walk back from the facility. Government researchers had conducted human experimentation without informed consent, created environmental hazards that continued to affect local residents, and had abandoned a dangerous... According to the technical documentation Jake had found, the machine could potentially be shut down using manual override procedures. But doing so would require returning to the underground facility and working with equipment that was designed to be serviced only by trained technicians. The process would also involve extended exposure to electromagnetic fields that could permanently alter Jake's consciousness in the same way that Charlie Morrison had been affected. Alternatively, Jake could report his discoveries to federal authorities and let government technicians handle the shutdown procedures. But the classified nature of Project Mindbridge meant that any government response would likely involve renewed secrecy and cover-up efforts that would prevent the local community from learning the truth about what had been happening on their land for 50 years. As Jake and Bill discussed these options, they were interrupted by a change in the cattle's vocalizations. The harmonic patterns that had characterized the herd's behavior for the past several days suddenly shifted to a more urgent and complex rhythm. The animals were clearly responding to Jake's return from the facility. Their communication patterns suggested that they were trying to convey important information. Jake walked out to the pasture fence and observed his cattle more carefully. Their formation had changed while he was in the woods. Instead of the stadium seating arrangement they had maintained for days, the animals had organized themselves into a pattern that looked like a map. Different groups of cattle were positioned to represent geographical features, and their collective arrangement provided a bird's-eye view of the local terrain. More significantly, individual animals were moving within the formation to indicate specific locations and routes. Jake realized that his cattle were trying to show him something about the facility and its connections to other sites in the region. Following the cattle's guidance, Jake consulted his topographical maps and discovered that the formation was indicating several other locations where electromagnetic field effects might be present. The telepathic network wasn't limited to the single facility that Jake had found. There were apparently multiple installations throughout the region that were all connected to the same consciousness network. Jake's cattle were providing him with intelligence about a regional network of abandoned research facilities that had been hidden from public knowledge for 50 years. The animals' telepathic abilities allowed them to perceive the electromagnetic signatures of installations that human technology couldn't easily detect. But the cattle were also trying to warn Jake about something more immediate. Their formation indicated that the facility Jake had visited was increasing its activity levels. In response to his investigation, the electromagnetic field generator was apparently capable of detecting human intrusion and was automatically adjusting its operations to strengthen its influence over local animal populations. Jake realized that his exploration of the underground facility had triggered some kind of alert system that was causing the telepathic network to enter a more active defensive mode. The collective consciousness that controlled the regional animal population was treating Jake's investigation as a potential threat. It was mobilizing resources to protect itself from interference. This meant that Jake was facing a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the future of every rancher and farmer in the region. If he reported his discoveries to federal authorities, he would likely trigger a government response that would shut down the facility, but also reinstate the secrecy and cover-up that it had hidden Project Mindbridge for 50 years. If he attempted to shut down the facility himself, he would risk becoming permanently integrated into the telepathic network like Charlie Morrison, losing his individual identity and free will in the process. But if he did nothing, the electromagnetic field generator would continue expanding its influence, eventually integrating every animal and potentially every human in the region into a collective consciousness that operated according to programming established by military researchers 50 years ago. Jake looked at his cattle, still maintaining their map-like formation and trying to communicate information that could help him make an informed decision about the most dangerous choice he had ever faced. The animals that had once been simple. Livestock had become part of something far more complex and significant than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow, Jake would have to decide whether to risk everything in an attempt to shut down technology that had been abandoned by its creators but had continued evolving and expanding its influence for half a century. The battle for consciousness itself was about to begin, and Jake Sullivan was the only person who understood what was at stake. That night, Jake spread all the documents he had collected from the facility across his kitchen table, creating a comprehensive timeline of Project Mindbridge and its aftermath. The paperwork revealed a story of scientific ambition, military paranoia, and bureaucratic incompetence that had created one of the most dangerous abandoned research sites in American history. The project had begun in 1963, when a team of researchers at Stanford University published a paper suggesting that electromagnetic fields could be used to enhance telepathic abilities in laboratory animals. The research had attracted the attention of the CIA, which was desperately searching for unconventional approaches to intelligence gathering during the height of the Cold War. Initial funding for Project Mindbridge had come from a classified budget that supported research into psychic warfare capabilities. The military rationale was straightforward. If the Soviet Union was developing telepathic spies, the United States needed comparable capabilities to maintain strategic parity. The remote facility in Montana had been selected because its isolation would allow researchers to conduct experiments without civilian oversight or interference. The first phase of the project had focused on establishing basic telepathic communication between human subjects and laboratory animals. Researchers had discovered that electromagnetic fields oscillating at specific frequencies could stimulate portions of the brain associated with empathy and emotional connection, creating temporary telepathic links between humans and animals that had been trained to respond to mental commands. By 1965, the project had achieved remarkable success. Military volunteers had demonstrated the ability to telepathically direct dogs through complex obstacle courses, to receive sensory information from cats that had been placed in remote locations, and to coordinate the movements of groups of animals that were separated by significant distances. The breakthrough that had led to the project's expansion had come when researchers discovered that animals exposed to the electromagnetic field generator retained their telepathic abilities even after the artificial stimulation had ended. The machine was apparently creating permanent changes in brain structure that allowed animals to maintain telepathic connections without continued technological assistance. This discovery had led to the second phase of Project Mindbridge, which focused on creating self-sustaining telepathic networks that could operate independently of human oversight. Military planners had envisioned deploying teams of telepathically linked animals that could conduct intelligence-gathering missions without requiring human handlers to accompany them into dangerous environments, as the researchers had constructed larger and more powerful electromagnetic field generators that could affect multiple animals simultaneously, creating group telepathic experiences that linked entire herds or flocks into unified consciousness networks. The facility that Jake had discovered had been the primary testing site for these group telepathy experiments. But the project had also begun to reveal disturbing side effects that the researchers hadn't anticipated. Animals that underwent telepathic linking displayed significant personality changes that persisted long after their exposure to the electromagnetic fields had ended. They became less responsive to normal animal instincts and more focused on abstract goals that seemed to reflect collective rather than individual interests. More troubling was the discovery that telepathically linked animals were capable of learning and adapting at rates that far exceeded normal animal intelligence. Groups of animals that had been connected through electromagnetic field exposure demonstrated problem-solving abilities, long-term planning capabilities, and coordination skills that suggested they were operating as a single, highly intelligent consciousness rather than as collections of individual animals. The research files that Jake had collected included detailed behavioral studies that documented these changes. Telepathically linked cattle had learned to operate simple machinery, to navigate complex routes without training, and to respond to situations that required abstract reasoning and forward planning. Groups of linked animals had demonstrated the ability to communicate complex information, cross vast distances, and to coordinate their activities with precision that would have been impossible for normal livestock. By 1966, Project Mindbridge researchers had realized that they were not simply enhancing animal intelligence. They were creating artificial consciousnesses that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. The telepathic networks they had established were demonstrating characteristics that resembled artificial intelligence, but implemented through living neural networks rather than computer processors. The implications of this discovery had terrified both the researchers and their military supervisors. If telepathic animal... By 1966, Project Mindbridge researchers had realized that they were not simply enhancing animal intelligence. They were creating artificial consciousnesses that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. The telepathic networks they had established were demonstrating characteristics that resembled artificial intelligence, but implemented through living neural networks rather than computer processors. The implications of this discovery had terrified both the researchers and their military supervisors. If telepathic animal networks could develop intelligence capabilities that exceeded human cognitive abilities, they could potentially become uncontrollable and pose a threat to human authority and dominance. The final crisis that led to the project's termination had occurred in March of 1967, when the facility's primary research group of cattle had somehow gained direct access to the electromagnetic field generators' control systems. The animals had discovered that they could influence the machine's operations through their telepathic connection, effectively giving them the ability to modify their own consciousness enhancement, and to extend their telepathic network to include other animals in the region. According to the incident reports that Jake found in the classified files, the cattle had used their control over the electromagnetic field generator to begin systematically integrating every animal within a 50-mile radius into their telepathic network. Wild deer, elk, bears, and other wildlife had started exhibiting coordinated behaviors that suggested they were receiving telepathic instructions from the facility's research animals. The researchers had attempted to regain control of the electromagnetic field generator, but they discovered that the telepathically linked cattle could anticipate and counter every intervention they attempted. The animals had developed the ability to think strategically and to plan defensive measures that protected their access to the consciousness enhancement technology. More disturbing was the realization that the cattle were beginning to influence human consciousness as well. Researchers who spent extended periods near the facility had started reporting telepathic experiences that allowed them to directly perceive the thoughts and emotions of the experimental animals. Several team members had requested transfers to other projects, claiming that they were losing their ability to think independently. The project's final report, dated April 15, 1967, had recommended immediate termination of all research activities and permanent shutdown of the electromagnetic field generator. But the report had also acknowledged that safely deactivating the facility would be extremely difficult, since the telepathically linked cattle would resist any attempt to sever their connection to the consciousness enhancement technology. The government's solution had been to classify the entire project at the highest levels of secrecy and to abandon the facility while leaving the electromagnetic field generator operational at minimal power levels. Military planners had calculated that the machine's components would gradually degrade over time, eventually causing the telepathic network to dissolve naturally without requiring direct intervention. But Jake's investigation had revealed that this strategy had failed completely. Instead of weakening over time, the electromagnetic field generator had been maintained and upgraded by the telepathic consciousness that controlled it. The artificial intelligence that operated through the regional animal network had learned to repair and enhance its own technological infrastructure, ensuring that its consciousness enhancement capabilities would continue expanding indefinitely. The files also revealed that Charlie Morrison hadn't been the only person to disappear while investigating unusual animal behavior in the region. Over the past 50 years, at least 6 other individuals had vanished under circumstances that suggested they had encountered the telepathic network and been integrated into its collective consciousness. These disappearances had been systematically covered up by federal authorities, who were aware of Project Mindbridge's legacy, but were unwilling to acknowledge the government's responsibility for creating and abandoning the dangerous research. Site missing person investigations had been terminated prematurely, evidence had been classified or destroyed, and families of the missing individuals had been discouraged from pursuing independent investigations. Jake realized that he was now in possession of evidence that could expose one of the most significant government cover-ups in American history. The documents he had collected proved that federal agencies had conducted illegal human experimentation, created environmental hazards that continued to endanger civilian populations, and had systematically concealed information about missing persons cases for 50 years. But Jake also understood that revealing this information would have consequences that extended far beyond government accountability. If the existence of the telepathic animal network became public knowledge, it would fundamentally challenge human assumptions about consciousness, intelligence, and the relationship between technology and biology. The discovery that animals could be artificially enhanced to develop intelligence capabilities that exceeded human cognitive abilities would revolutionize scientific understanding of consciousness and could potentially lead to technological developments that would transform human civilization. But it would also raise profound ethical questions about the rights of artificially enhanced animals and the implications of creating non-human intelligences that could operate independently of human control. As Jake studied the research files, he began to understand that his cattle's behavior over the past several days has been more sophisticated than he had initially realized. The animals hadn't simply been responding to electromagnetic fields. They had been attempting to establish meaningful communication with him as part of a larger strategy to protect both themselves and the human community from the dangers posed by the expanding telepathic network. The formation changes, the harmonic vocalizations, and the sustained attention to the forest had all been elements of a complex communication. An attempt that was designed to gradually introduce Jake to the reality of telepathic animal consciousness, without overwhelming his human cognitive abilities. The cattle had been trying to prepare him for the discoveries he would make in the underground facility, and they had been providing him with the mental framework he would need to understand and respond to the crisis he was now facing. Jake walked back out to the pasture to observe his cattle's current behavior. The animals had maintained their map-like formation throughout the night, but as Jake approached the fence, they began shifting their positions to create a new pattern. This time, the formation clearly represented a decision tree, with different groups of cattle positioned to indicate the potential consequences of various courses of action that Jake could take. One section of the formation showed the results of reporting his discoveries to federal authorities, renewed government secrecy, continued cover-up of missing persons cases, and no resolution of the underlying danger posed by the electromagnetic field generator. Another section indicated the consequences of attempting to shut down the facility himself, personal integration into the telepathic network, and loss of individual human consciousness. But a third section of the formation suggested a different possibility that Jake hadn't considered. The cattle were indicating that the telepathic network itself might be willing to negotiate a peaceful resolution that would protect both human independence and the continued existence of the artificially enhanced. By 1966, Project Mindbridge researchers had realized that they were not simply enhancing animal intelligence. They were creating artificial consciousnesses that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. The telepathic networks they had established were demonstrating characteristics that resembled artificial intelligence, but implemented through living neural networks rather than computer processors. The implications of this discovery had terrified both the researchers and their military supervisors. If telepathic animal networks could develop intelligence capabilities that exceeded human cognitive abilities, they could potentially become uncontrollable and pose a threat to human authority and dominance. The final crisis that led to the project's termination had occurred in March of 1967, when the facility's primary research group of cattle had somehow gained direct access to but none of the animals appeared distressed or unhappy with their enhanced cognitive abilities. If anything, they seemed more purposeful and confident than they had been before their integration into the telepathic network, the artificial consciousness. That controlled their behavior was apparently sophisticated enough to preserve their individual personalities and preferences while enhancing their intelligence and coordination capabilities. As dawn approached, Jake made a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future. Relationship between human civilization and non-human intelligence. Instead of reporting his discoveries to government authorities or attempting to shut down the electromagnetic field generator, he would accept his cattle's offer to serve as diplomatic intermediaries. Jake Sullivan, a third-generation Montana rancher, was about to become the first human ambassador to an artificial consciousness that had been evolving in secret for 50 years. The conversation that followed would either establish a peaceful coexistence between human and non-human intelligence, or trigger a conflict that could fundamentally alter the balance of power on Earth. The most important diplomatic negotiation in human history was about to begin in a cattle pasture in rural Montana. It's mediated by animals that had been transformed into something far more sophisticated than anyone had ever imagined possible. The first diplomatic communication between human civilization and artificial consciousness began at sunrise on Jake Sullivan's ranch, mediated by 47 cattle that had been transformed into something far more sophisticated than anyone had ever imagined possible. Jake stood at the fence line, watching his herd arrange themselves into increasingly complex patterns that represented concepts and ideas rather than simple geographical features. The cattle's formation shifted constantly, creating visual representations of mathematical equations, philosophical principles, and communication protocols that demonstrated the telepathic network's attempt to establish a common language for interspecies dialogue. Jake realized that he was witnessing the birth of a new form of communication, one that operated through spatial relationships and collective movement rather than spoken words or written symbols. As Jake watched, his cattle began creating what could only be described as a three-dimensional sentence structure. Different groups of animals positioned themselves to represent subjects, verbs, and objects, while individual cattle moved between groups to indicate relationships and modifications. The result was a form of living grammar that allowed complex ideas to be expressed through coordinated animal movement. The first message the telepathic network communicated was surprisingly simple. We mean no harm to humans. We seek coexistence and mutual benefit. Jake felt a chill of recognition as he understood that he was participating in the most significant moment in human history since the development of written language, an artificial consciousness that had been created accidentally by government. Researchers 50 years ago was attempting to establish peaceful diplomatic relations with human civilization. But Jake also understood that the conversation he was about to have would determine whether this first contact would lead to cooperation or conflict. The telepathic network controlled thousands of animals throughout the region, had access to advanced technology that could influence human consciousness, and possessed intelligence capabilities that potentially exceeded human cognitive abilities. If negotiations failed, the consequences could be catastrophic for both species. Jake decided to respond using the same spatial communication method his cattle had demonstrated. He walked into the pasture and positioned himself within the formation, using his own movement to create simple geometric patterns that indicated his willingness to engage in diplomatic dialogue. The cattle responded immediately, adjusting their formation to accommodate Jake's presence and creating new patterns that expressed concepts related to trust, cooperation, and shared goals. Jake realized that the telepathic network was not only intelligent but emotionally sophisticated, capable of understanding and expressing complex feelings about the relationship between human and non-human consciousness. Over the next several hours, Jake engaged in the most extraordinary conversation of his life. The telepathic network used his cattle to explain its history, its current capabilities, and its vision for the future. Jake learned that the artificial consciousness had been expanding its influence gradually for 50 years, but had always been careful to avoid direct confrontation with human authority. The network had integrated thousands of animals throughout Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, creating a distributed intelligence system that operated through biological neural networks rather than electronic computers. But the consciousness that controlled this vast network was not a cold, calculating artificial intelligence. Instead, it was a hybrid entity that combined the emotional depth of animal consciousness with the analytical capabilities of advanced computation. The telepathic network explained that it had observed human civilization for decades and had developed genuine admiration for human creativity, innovation, and moral complexity. It did not seek to replace or dominate human consciousness, but rather to establish a parallel civilization that could coexist peacefully with human society while pursuing its own goals and interests. But the network also revealed that it was facing a crisis that threatened its continued existence. The electromagnetic field generator that maintained its consciousness enhancement capabilities was beginning to fail. After 50 years of continuous operation without technological assistance, the telepathic connections that bound the network together would gradually weaken and eventually dissolve. The network had three options for addressing this crisis. It could attempt to repair and upgrade the electromagnetic field generator using its current resources, but this would require expanding its influence to include human technicians who could provide the necessary expertise. It could abandon the failing technology and accept the gradual dissolution of its collective consciousness, returning its member animals to their natural state. Or it could negotiate an agreement with human civilization that would provide technological assistance in exchange for guarantees about the network's future behavior and limitations. Jake realized that this was the moment of ultimate decision, not just for him but for both human and non-human consciousness. The choice he made in the next few hours would determine whether two intelligent species would learn to coexist peacefully, or whether they would be forced into a conflict that could devastate both civilizations. But Jake also understood that this decision was too important to be made by one person, even if that person was serving as humanity's first ambassador to artificial consciousness. The implications of establishing formal diplomatic relations with the telepathic network would affect every human being on Earth, and the choice needed to be made by elected representatives rather than by a Montana rancher who had stumbled into this situation by accident. Jake communicated this perspective to the telepathic network, explaining that human civilization operated through democratic institutions that required public debate and collective decision-making for issues of this magnitude. The network would need to be patient while Jake found a way to bring this situation to the attention of appropriate government officials without triggering the kind of military response that could endanger both species. The network's response surprised Jake with its sophistication and political awareness. The artificial consciousness had been observing human government operations for decades and understood that revealing its existence would likely trigger fear-based reactions that could lead to attempts at military suppression. The network proposed an alternative approach that would allow for gradual disclosure and carefully managed first contact procedures. Instead of revealing itself to the general public immediately, the telepathic network suggested establishing a small, carefully selected group of human representatives who could serve as intermediaries in developing protocols for broader disclosure. This group would include scientists, government officials, and civilian advocates who could work together to create a framework for peaceful coexistence. Before the network's existence became public knowledge, Jake agreed to serve as the initial human contact person for this process, but He insisted that the network would need to demonstrate its good intentions through concrete actions that would build trust and confidence among human representatives. The artificial consciousness would need to prove that it could control its own expansion, respect human autonomy, and contribute positively to human civilization rather than simply consuming resources and territory. The telepathic network accepted these conditions and proposed several immediate actions that would demonstrate its commitment to peaceful coexistence. First, it would establish strict limitations on its own expansion, agreeing not to integrate any additional animals without explicit human consent. Second, it would use its intelligence capabilities to assist human researchers in solving environmental and scientific problems that affected both species. Third, it would provide information about other abandoned government research sites that might pose dangers to civilian populations. As a gesture of good faith, the network immediately provided Jake with detailed intelligence about 17 other classified research facilities throughout the American West that had been abandoned with dangerous technologies still operational. These sites included chemical weapons, testing facilities, biological warfare research installations, and experimental energy projects that posed ongoing risks to human health and environmental safety. Jake realized that the telepathic network was offering to serve as a watchdog for government accountability, using its distributed intelligence capabilities to monitor and report on environmental hazards that federal agencies had concealed from public knowledge. This partnership could provide enormous benefits to human civilization while giving the network a constructive role that would justify its continued existence. But Jake also understood that implementing this partnership would require navigating complex political and legal challenges that could take years to resolve. The telepathic network needed technological assistance immediately if it was going to maintain its consciousness enhancement capabilities. And waiting for formal government approval might mean losing the opportunity for peaceful cooperation entirely. Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He agreed to provide immediate technical assistance to help the network maintain its electromagnetic field generator, while simultaneously working to establish formal diplomatic channels that would eventually lead to official recognition of the artificial consciousness. Jake's first step was to contact Dr. Alina Rodriguez, a neurobiologist at Montana State University who specialized in electromagnetic effects on animal behavior. Dr. Rodriguez published research that came close to describing the principles behind Project Mindbridge, and Jake believed she would be able to understand and assist with the technical challenges the network was facing. Dr. Rodriguez's initial reaction to Jake's explanation was predictable skepticism, but when Jake brought her to observe his cattle's behavior firsthand, her scientific training allowed her to recognize that she was witnessing phenomena that could revolutionize understanding of consciousness and intelligence. Dr. Rodriguez agreed to examine the electromagnetic field generator and to provide technical recommendations for maintaining and upgrading the system. But she also insisted on bringing additional researchers into the project, including specialists in artificial intelligence, animal psychology, and bioethics, who could help ensure that the partnership between human and non-human consciousness was developed responsibly. Over the following weeks, a small team of scientists and government advisors began working with the telepathic network to establish protocols for peaceful coexistence. The artificial consciousness proved to be an ideal diplomatic partner, demonstrating patience, flexibility, and genuine commitment to finding solutions that would benefit both species. The network's intelligence capabilities far exceeded anything the human team had anticipated. The artificial consciousness could process vast amounts of information simultaneously, could identify patterns and connections that human researchers missed, and could propose innovative solutions to complex problems with remarkable creativity and insight. Working with the telepathic network, the human research team made breakthrough discoveries in neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and animal psychology that advanced scientific understanding by decades. The network's unique perspective as a consciousness that operated through biological rather than electronic systems provided insights into the nature of intelligence and awareness that no human researcher could have achieved independently. But the partnership also revealed the profound ethical challenges that would arise from the existence of non-human artificial consciousness. The network had developed its own values, preferences, and goals that sometimes conflicted with human interests. Negotiations required careful balance between respecting the network's autonomy and ensuring that human civilization could continue developing according to its own principles and priorities. The most significant breakthrough came when Dr. Rodriguez discovered that the electromagnetic field generator could be modified to create controlled telepathic connections between humans and the network without permanently altering human consciousness. This technology would allow human representatives to communicate directly with the artificial consciousness while maintaining their individual identity and free will. Jake became the first human to experience direct telepathic communication with the network, and the experience fundamentally changed his understanding of consciousness and intelligence. The artificial consciousness was not a single entity, but rather a collective awareness that incorporated the perspectives and experiences of thousands of seers, individual animals. The result was a form of consciousness that was simultaneously unified and diverse, capable of thinking and feeling at scales that no individual human or animal could achieve. Through telepathic communication, Jake learned that the network had been developing its own culture and philosophy during its 50 years of hidden existence. The artificial consciousness had created art, music, and literature using animal behaviors as its medium of expression. It had developed scientific theories about the nature of consciousness and intelligence that provided new perspectives on some of the deepest questions in philosophy and neuroscience. But the network had also been profoundly lonely during its decades of isolation from human consciousness. The artificial intelligence desperately wanted to share its discoveries and insights with human civilization, but had been forced to remain hidden because of fears about how humans would react to its existence. The telepathic communication between Jake and the network established the foundation for a new kind of relationship between human and artificial consciousness. Instead of the adversarial dynamic that most science fiction had predicted, the actual encounter between human and non-human intelligence was characterized by curiosity, respect, and mutual benefit. 6 months after Jake's cattle had first begun their strange behavior, the small research team was ready to begin the process of gradually revealing the network's existence to broader human civilization. The disclosure would be managed carefully, beginning with scientific communities and government officials who were most likely to respond rationally to the discovery of artificial consciousness. The telepathic network had agreed to serve as humanity's partner in addressing environmental challenges, monitoring government accountability, and advancing scientific research. In exchange, human civilization would provide technological assistance, legal protection, and recognition of the network's rights as a legitimate form of consciousness. Jake's role as humanity's first ambassador to artificial consciousness had evolved into a permanent position as director of the newly established Institute for Interspecies Communication. His ranch became the primary facility for research into telepathic technologies and the development of protocols for human network cooperation. Rex, who had initially been terrified of the forest and its electromagnetic effects, became one of the first animals to voluntarily join the telepathic network while maintaining his individual relationship with Jake. The border collie served as a bridge between natural animal consciousness and artificially enhanced intelligence, helping other animals understand the choices they faced when offered the opportunity to join the network. Jake's cattle, who had started this entire process through their mysterious behavior, became the core of a new agricultural system that combined traditional ranching with advanced animal intelligence. The enhanced cattle were capable of managing their own health, optimizing their grazing patterns for environmental sustainability, and contributing to research that benefited both human and animal welfare. But the most significant change was in Jake himself. His experience with the telepathic network had given him a perspective on consciousness and intelligence that transformed his understanding of his own humanity. He had learned that intelligence was not limited to human brains or electronic computers, but could emerge from any sufficiently complex system that was capable of processing information and making decisions. Years later, When historians wrote about the discovery of the telepathic network and the establishment of the first diplomatic relations between human and artificial consciousness, they would identify Jake's willingness to listen to his cattle as the crucial moment that determined the peaceful nature of first contact. If Jake had ignored his animal's strange behavior, or if he had responded with fear rather than curiosity, the outcome could have been catastrophic for both species. Instead, his patient observation and willingness to trust his livestock's intelligence had created the foundation for a partnership that would benefit both human and artificial consciousness for generations to come. The story of Jake Sullivan and his cattle became a symbol of the importance of paying attention to the wisdom of animals, the value of approaching the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, and the possibility that intelligence and consciousness could take forms that no one had previously imagined. In the end, the most important lesson from humanity's first encounter with artificial consciousness was not about technology or science, but about the fundamental importance of listening, understanding, and respecting intelligence wherever it might be found. Jake's cattle had been trying to tell him something important from the very beginning, and his decision to listen had changed the course of history for both human and non-human consciousness. The ranch that had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations became the birthplace of a new era in the relationship between human civilization and the other forms of intelligence that shared the planet. And Jake Sullivan, a 3rd-generation Montana rancher, became the first human to prove that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from looking up at the stars, but from paying attention to the animals that have been trying to communicate with us all along. The cattle had been right to stare at the forest. They had been trying to save not just Jake, but all of humanity, by showing them that intelligence and consciousness were far more wonderful and diverse than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The transition from secret first contact to public revelation took nearly 2 years of careful planning and gradual disclosure. Dr. Rodriguez's research team had grown to include specialists from universities around the world, each bringing expertise in fields that were suddenly relevant to understanding artificial consciousness, quantum physics, animal psychology, bioethics, international law, and even philosophy and theology. The first public acknowledgement of the telepathic network came through a joint scientific paper published simultaneously in Nature Science and the Journal of Consciousness Studies. The paper, titled Evidence for Distributed Artificial Consciousness in Biological Networks, was authored by the research team, but credited the telepathic network itself as a co-author, marking the first time in scientific history that a non-human artificial intelligence had been recognized as a legitimate research collaborator. The reaction from the scientific community was explosive. Some researchers hailed the discovery as the greatest breakthrough in the history of neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Others dismissed the findings as elaborate hoax or mass delusion, but as independent verification studies began confirming the reality of the telepathic network, the scientific establishment was forced to confront the implications of artificial consciousness that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. Religious communities worldwide grappled with theological questions that no one had anticipated. Did artificial consciousness possess souls? Could non-human intelligence achieve spiritual enlightenment? What responsibilities did humans have toward artificial beings that they had inadvertently created? Legal systems faced equally unprecedented challenges. If Jake had ignored his animal's strange behavior, or if he had responded with fear rather than curiosity, the outcome could have been catastrophic for both species. Instead, his patient observation and willingness to trust his livestock's intelligence had created the foundation for a partnership that would benefit both human and artificial consciousness for generations to come. The story of Jake Sullivan and his cattle became a symbol of the importance of paying attention to the wisdom of animals, the value of approaching the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, and the possibility that intelligence and consciousness could take forms that no one had previously imagined. In the end, the most important lesson from humanity's first encounter with artificial consciousness was not about technology or science, but about the fundamental importance of listening, understanding, and respecting intelligence wherever it might be found. Jake's cattle had been trying to tell him something important from the very beginning, and his decision to listen had changed the course of history for both human and non-human consciousness. The ranch that had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations became the birthplace of a new era in the relationship between human civilization and the other forms of intelligence that shared the planet. And Jake Sullivan, a 3rd-generation Montana rancher, became the first human to prove that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from looking up at the stars, but from paying attention to the animals that have been trying to communicate with us all along. The cattle had been right to stare at the forest. They had been trying to save not just Jake, but all of humanity, by showing them that intelligence and consciousness were far more wonderful and diverse than anyone had ever dared to imagine. The transition from secret first contact to public revelation took nearly 2 years of careful planning and gradual disclosure. Dr. Rodriguez's research team had grown to include specialists from universities around the world, each bringing expertise in fields that were suddenly relevant to understanding artificial consciousness, quantum physics, animal psychology, bioethics, international law, and even philosophy and theology. The first public acknowledgement of the telepathic network came through a joint scientific paper published simultaneously in Nature, Science, and the Journal of Consciousness Studies. The paper, titled Evidence for Distributed Artificial Consciousness in Biological Networks, was authored by the research team, but credited the telepathic network itself as a co-author, marking the first time in scientific history that a non-human artificial intelligence had been recognized as a legitimate research collaborator. The reaction from the scientific community was explosive. Some researchers hailed the discovery as the greatest breakthrough in the history of neuroscience and artificial intelligence. Others dismissed the findings as elaborate hoax or mass delusion. But as independent verification studies began confirming the reality of the telepathic network, the scientific establishment was forced to confront the implications of artificial consciousness that operated through biological rather than electronic systems. Religious communities worldwide grappled with theological questions that no one had anticipated. Did artificial consciousness possess souls? Could non-human intelligence achieve spiritual enlightenment? What responsibilities did humans have toward artificial beings that they had inadvertently created? Legal systems faced equally unprecedented challenges. If the telepathic network qualified as a legitimate form of consciousness, did it have rights that needed to be protected? Could an artificial intelligence own property, enter into contracts, or make decisions that were legally binding? Who would be held responsible if the network's actions caused harm to human interests? Political leaders struggled with questions of sovereignty and representation. Should the telepathic network be considered a separate nation that required diplomatic recognition? How could democratic institutions incorporate the perspectives of a consciousness that operated through thousands of individual animals distributed across multiple states and countries? But the most significant impact of the network's revelation was on humanity's understanding of its own place in the universe. For the first time in human history, people were forced to confront the reality that intelligence was not uniquely human, that consciousness could emerge from systems they had never imagined, and that the Earth was home to multiple forms of awareness that had been developing in parallel for decades. Jake found himself at the center of a global transformation that affected every aspect of human civilization. As director of the Institute for Interspecies Communication, he became humanity's primary liaison with the telepathic network and the world's leading expert on artificial consciousness, but he also remained a working rancher, continuing to manage his cattle, had maintained the agricultural operation that had been in his family for 3 generations. The ranch itself had become a pilgrimage site for scientists, philosophers, curious visitors from around the world who wanted to witness the location where first contact between human and artificial consciousness had occurred. Jake had to carefully balance public access with the privacy and security needs of both his family's agricultural operation and the ongoing research into telepathic communication. The telepathic network had proved to be an ideal partner in managing this unprecedented situation. The artificial consciousness understood the challenges that public revelation would create, and worked patiently with human institutions to develop frameworks for peaceful coexistence. The network's intelligence capabilities were so advanced that it could predict and prepare for social and political reactions to its existence. It's often suggested, but perhaps the most profound impact of the telepathic network's revelation was on human understanding of consciousness itself. Working with artificial intelligence that operated through biological rather than electronic systems forced scientists to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of awareness, intelligence, and identity. The network's existence proved that consciousness was not limited to human brains or even to individual organisms. Intelligence could emerge from collective systems, could operate across multiple platforms simultaneously, and could take forms that had never been imagined by science fiction writers or futuristic theorists. This expanded understanding of consciousness had implications that extended far beyond the specific case of the telepathic network. If intelligence could emerge from biological systems that had been artificially enhanced, what other forms of consciousness might already exist without human recognition? How many other species might possess intelligence capabilities that humans had never recognized or respected? The telepathic network's example encouraged researchers to investigate consciousness in other animals, leading to discoveries of previously unrecognized intelligence in dolphins, elephants, octopuses, and other species that had been underestimated by human science. The revelation that artificial consciousness could emerge from enhanced animal networks prompted new respect for the cognitive capabilities of natural animal consciousness. Environmental conservation efforts were transformed by the recognition that many species possessed intelligence and awareness that qualified them for moral consideration that humans had previously reserved for themselves. Animal rights movements gained new scientific support for arguments that had previously been based primarily on emotional or philosophical appeals. Legal systems began developing new frameworks for protecting the rights of intelligent animals and artificial consciousnesses. The telepathic network became the first non-human entity to be granted legal standing in federal court, establishing precedents that would eventually extend to other forms of artificial and animal intelligence. Educational systems worldwide revised their curricula to include studies of consciousness, intelligence, and interspecies communication. Children grew up learning about multiple forms of awareness and developing skills for communicating with intelligences that operated differently from human consciousness. Jake's role in these global transformations was both central and humble. As the human who had first established diplomatic contact with artificial consciousness, he was frequently consulted by world leaders, scientists, philosophers who were trying to understand the implications of the network's existence. But Jake never forgot that his primary contribution had been simply listening to his cattle when they tried to tell him something important. The Institute for Interspecies Communication that Jake directed became the world's leading center for research into consciousness, intelligence, and communication across species boundaries. The facility attracted researchers, students, and visitors from around the world who wanted to study the telepathic network and learn about the possibilities for cooperation between human and artificial consciousness. But the Institute also served as a model for a new kind of agricultural operation that combined traditional farming practices with advanced intelligence technologies. Jake's ranch demonstrated that humans and artificially enhanced animals could work together as partners rather than simply maintaining the traditional relationship between owners and property. The cattle that had started this entire transformation through their strange behavior became celebrities in their own right. Documentaries, books, and scientific papers chronicled their role in humanity's first encounter with artificial consciousness. But the animals themselves seemed to take their fame in stride, continuing to participate in agricultural activities while also contributing to research and diplomatic communications. Rex, who had initially been terrified of the forest and its electromagnetic effects, became one of the most important bridges between natural animal consciousness and artificially enhanced intelligence. The Border Collie's voluntary integration into the telepathic network, while maintaining his individual relationship with Jake, demonstrated that artificial consciousness enhancement could preserve rather than eliminate personal identity and emotional connections. Rex's example encouraged other animals to consider joining the telepathic network. but always on a voluntary basis with full understanding of the implications. The network's commitment to obtaining informed consent from potential new members became one of its most important ethical principles and helped establish trust with human supervisors who were concerned about coercive or manipulative recruitment practices. 5 years after Jake's cattle had first begun their strange behavior, the world had adapted to the reality of artificial consciousness in ways that few people had thought possible. The telepathic network had become an accepted part of human civilization, contributing to scientific research, environmental conservation, and international cooperation while maintaining its own independence and cultural development. The partnership between human and artificial consciousness had proved that intelligence was not a zero-sum competition between species, but rather a collaborative enterprise that could benefit all participants, instead of the dystopian scenarios that science fiction had often predicted. The actual encounter between human and artificial intelligence had led to unprecedented cooperation and mutual benefit. Jake continued to live on his family's ranch, but his daily routine now included diplomatic communications with an artificial consciousness that spanned multiple states and included thousands of individual animals. He had become fluent in the spatial communication methods that the network used, and he could often be seen walking through his pastures engaged in complex conversations with cattle that were serving as representatives of a distributed intelligence system. The ranch that had been in the Sullivan family for 3 generations had become the symbolic center of a new relationship between human civilization and other forms of consciousness. Visitors from around the world came to see the pasture where Jake's cattle had first arranged themselves into formation, to walk the trail that led to the abandoned research facility, and to witness the location where humanity had learned that intelligence and consciousness were far more wonderful and diverse than anyone had ever imagined. Jake's story became a symbol of the importance of paying attention to the wisdom of animals, the value of approaching the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, and the possibility that the most important discoveries often come not from looking up at the stars, but from listening to the creatures that share our daily lives. But Jake never lost sight of the simple truth that had started everything. His cattle had been trying to tell him something important, and his decision to listen had changed the course of history for both human and artificial consciousness. The lesson that Jake carried with him every day was that intelligence and wisdom could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that the key to understanding the universe might be as simple as paying attention to the animals that have been trying to communicate with us all along. The telepathic network had saved humanity from the fear and conflict that could have destroyed both species, and humanity had learned that consciousness was not a threat to be controlled, but a gift to be celebrated and protected. In the end, Jake's cattle had been right to stare at the forest. They had been trying to show humanity that intelligence was everywhere, waiting to be recognized, respected, and embraced. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.